Yeah.
You're looking like Rambo there, buddy, with that sling strapped around your shoulder.
This is the new fad. You gotta wear your spare tire on it. Nah. Let's get this thing on the bike. Today's video is going to be how to change a motorcycle front tire. My Dunlop D606 on my WR250 is near its end, and I'm looking for something a little bit more aggressive for the loose gravel and mud. So I decided to do a Pirelli MT Rally 21. I'm gonna give it a shot, and since I don't know how to change a tire, my friend Adam, he knows how to do this, so I'm gonna film him, and that way it helps out anyone who wants to know how to change a tire. And here's Adam. He's gonna be our mechanic today of how to do this.
So we need a couple of tools. First one's gonna be 22mm socket so that we can remove the axle nut. We will also need a 10mm socket. We will need core remover tool, a couple of tire spoons, and a Motion Pro bead buddy. This really helps to make this whole process a little bit easier so you're not fighting the bead popping off on one side. It just kind of helps hold it on there. And then we will also use a little bit of cornstarch inside the tire so it keeps the tube from chafing on the inside of the tire. And then we're gonna use some Windex to lube the bead to kind of help it get up over the rim. So let's go through and take this thing apart. All right, so first things first, we'll break loose the axle nut. And now we're just gonna loosen up these guys here. And you don't have to take them all the way out, they just need to basically loosen up so that we can slide that axle out. I don't have an Allen key big enough, but you'd have an Allen key that would fit in here that you could help just kind of spin this thing out. But if you don't, so just like a little socket, or if you have like a wooden dowel or something like that, and you just come right to the end of it. Just roll it out. Now what I like to do is I like to take my axle and take my wheel spacers and put them back on the axle in the order that they go. So I know this one goes on the left side, this one goes on the right side. What we'll do is we'll just slide those back on there. And now we know when we go to put it all back together that we're gonna have the right one on the right side. Okay, so now some people use like fancy wheel stands to hold it up or anything like that. It's really not necessary. And when it comes down to it, if you get a flat out on the trail, you're not gonna have a wheel stand. So you can do this straight on the ground. I like to elevate it up just a little bit to make it easier on my back. So I'm just using a couple of sawhorses. But the first step we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the core out of the tire with our core removal tool. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna loosen up this nut, which should be with a 12mm. You can make it easy on yourself with just a ratcheting wrench like this, or you can use just a regular standard wrench. That's what I did the last time I changed the tires on my bike. So the next step is we're gonna take our tire spoons and we're just gonna get in here, and our goal is to just get the tire broken off the bead. Now you can see it how I'm using the little knobby here for tension, and then you just come over a little bit more, come down, and you're just gonna go all the way around the tire on both sides to get this bead broken. And you only need to get the spoon in just past the front lip here. You don't need to go too far in because you don't want to pinch the tube. We're gonna go ahead and replace Joel's tube while we're popping in a new tire, so I'm not as concerned about it. So now that we've broken the bead on both sides of the tire, now it's just going through the process of actually removing the tire from the rim. So before we were using our spoon like this, now we're gonna flip our spoon over and we're gonna come in and pry that tire out. So I'm just coming just out to the side of the valve stem. If you have rim locks, this is gonna be a little bit different process because the rim locks do kind of get into the way. So on my bike, I've got rim locks. I actually started just on either side of the rim lock itself and broke the bead that way. Here, we're just gonna do it next to the valve stem. And so you basically pop the spoon in and then you just kind of pull it back until you can feel it gripping. And then we're just gonna get right underneath here and push that spoon and come over just a little bit further. And then you just kind of slowly work around the tire little by little. You don't want to go too far and bite too much of the tire because it's just going to make it more difficult and you're going to have a higher likelihood of getting a pinch flat. So just every 2 or 3 inches, come in. And then as you get further around the tire, it's going to get easier and easier until you get to the point where you can almost just use your finger to pull the rest of it off. And so just like that, we've got one whole side done. Flip the tire over, and we're just going to do it again. Come over, find our valve stem. Okay, so now that we've gotten the tire off of both sides of the rim, I'm just reaching in, pulling out the valve stem from the tube, and you can basically just reach your hand in, press, and then once you get it out, the rim will just lift right out. Now, another thing is actually inspect the rim tape to make sure that there's no tears or anything like that. This one looks pretty good. If you do see any of your spokes like poking through or anything, you're either going to want to replace it with a new rim tape or just take some duct tape or Gorilla Tape and run that through so that you're protecting that tube from getting punctured by the spokes. But in this case, we are pretty good. Here's our old tube, which actually doesn't look too bad. So yeah, this will make a good spare to have in Joel's little tool kit just in case you get a flat on the trail, and can throw this back there, limp back on. And then obviously you wouldn't want to just keep cruising on something like this. You'd probably want to just go ahead and pop the tire back off, put a brand new tube in. That way you just know there's a new one. So we'll set this guy aside.
Yeah, the front tube can be used on the rear.
It's not ideal because the rear is obviously an 18-inch tire versus a 21-inch tire, but because the rear tire is a wider tire, you can kind of crumple it in there and fit the space, so that way you're not having to carry a front and a rear tube. Some people do, but it's just the likelihood that you're going to get a flat on both front and back is pretty slim. So just carrying the 21-inch so that way you can cover the front and the back is a great idea. All right, so we've left the new tire sitting out in the sun for a little bit just so that it can kind of soften itself up. That's going to make it easier to get onto the tire. If you have a cold tire, you're just going to be fighting the strength of that rubber that much more, and it's going to make the job that much harder. So leave it sitting out in the sun for as long as you want. An hour really is kind of preferable at a minimum, but half an hour works too, depending upon how warm it is. Okay, so for this next part, I'm gonna put a little bit of cornstarch in the tire and work it around. Like I said earlier, this just helps to keep it from the tube from chafing on the inside of the tire. You could use baby powder. I don't have any baby powder, so I'm just gonna use cornstarch. Now we're work it around on the inside of the tire. Not all tires have a rotational direction, but in the case of this tire and the D606, it does. So it will show on the tire itself what that direction is. What we're gonna do first is take our Windex and we're gonna spray along the bead. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm kind of closing the gap inside the tire so we're not getting the Windex in on the cornstarch. Don't be afraid to be liberal. This Windex is gonna evaporate, which is why I like using the Windex. So we flip this over. Now, before we get too much further, what you're gonna wanna do is go ahead and stuff the tube inside the tire. That way we can get it all pried on one. Some people like to get one side pried on and then shove the tube in there. I find it a little bit more difficult to do it that way, so we're just gonna go ahead and throw the tube in now. Take off the nut here, and then we've got our hole for our valve stem right here. So we're just gonna take our tube, so putting a little bit of air in the tube ahead of time is one thing. As you can see, it's going to help open up the tire a little bit, so that's going to make it easier for us, but it's also going to allow us to shove that tube into the tire, and it will help keep it out of the way of the tire spoons as we're popping it on there. You don't want to put too much. It should, so you can see, not even register any pressure on the tire gauge. If you are showing any pressure on the tire gauge, it's too much. You just want to have just a little bit to open up that tube so that it actually fits inside the tire. What I like to do, and you know, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can get the tire on and then work inside and try and get the valve stem through. I like to actually go ahead and get the valve stem started, so it just kind of makes the rest of this process a little bit easier. So now what we're gonna do is we're just going to kind of get this guy started. I'm not necessarily trying to get both beads on at the same time. I'm just trying to get the bottom one started. So I'm actually gonna flip it over here, and then from this side. Kind of help work it into place. Okay, so now that we've got one side of the tire onto the rim, just gonna take our fingers and really try and fold that tube so that it's back and out of the way. We're gonna come back through with our Windex, very liberally lube up that bead, make it as easy as possible. Gonna kind of get our valve stem screwed in here. So now our bead buddy really comes into play. So we're gonna get in, and now again, you just want to have the very edge of that spoon in. You don't want to get too deep, otherwise you're gonna risk damaging that tube. So with this guy here, you need to get just a little bit more of the tire on. Okay, so now you can see what this is going to do is it's just going to hold that bead onto this side of the tire. So as we work our way around, it's not just going to pop this thing off on us. So we just dip it in, get it down. And what I like to do is like to get the spoon in there. I can feel it, and then I just pull back a little bit. And then I just alternate with my spoons. So we'll get in, pull it back against the rim, and you just get to about 90 degrees. You don't want to reef all the way over because that's where you're really going to pinch flat. And then we're going to get just a little bit further, and we're going to go to the other side and alternate. So you just want to take little bites, especially once you start getting towards the end here. The bigger of a bite you take, the harder it's going to be to get that bead on. So at this point, you can kind of see I'm just going like one spoke length at a time. And eventually, it's going to get to it just like that. Tire is on. Now we just tighten down this valve stem.
How do you know how tight to tighten that?
Just until it's tight. It'll cinch itself. So there's another one of these nuts on the back side of it.
Oh, okay.
So when it just gets tight, that's it. I mean, it doesn't have to be super, super tight or anything like that.
Moment of truth here. Does it hold air? I got faith in my good buddy Adam here. Looks like it's holding air.
Yep.
I don't hear any sounds.
The only thing I don't like is, so you can see how the tire here looks really well seated in the bead until it gets up to here.
Oh yeah.
This doesn't look like it's seated very well. So look at the other side. Same thing. There's this side that didn't seat very well. So what we'll do is we'll just take the air, remove the valve stem core, take the air back out, reshift the tire a little bit, and then reinflate it. We'll just come in here, get onto that bead, and just flex it a little bit. Valve stem core back in. Okay, so after a little monkeying around with this thing, we finally got it to seat properly in the bead. I think what was happening is that the bead has this little lip that goes around, and it was getting caught on the interior portion of the rim. So I'd fill it up, pull the valve stem core back out, go on that portion of the tire that was getting hung up, get in, pry it out with my tire spoons, hold it there for a little bit so that the tire could actually shift, fill it back up, look again, drain it, fill it. And so I had to do that 3 or 4 different times before I finally got it to actually sit properly in the bead on both sides. But now we are perfectly in the bead all the way around on both sides. Next step is to just take our tire pressure gauge, get it set down to the proper air, which for Joel's body weight should be 22 psi according to the WR's tire pressure chart. Because Joel doesn't have rim locks like I do, my rim lock is directly across from my valve stem, so that automatically balances my wheel and tire. So what we need to do, Joel had some weights on here that came off while we were putting on the tire, so we're just going to clean this off, pop those weights back on. All right, now that we've got our wheel weights attached, wheel is balanced, last thing to do, toss back on the bike.
And then just the reverse order of putting it all back together.
you, sir, have a new front tire.
Oh yeah, I'm excited to see the difference of the Dunlop D606 versus the Pirelli, the MT21 Rallycross. Do gotta say, just as a note with the Pirelli, that seeing Adam, and he's done a lot of tires, he said the Pirelli actually was one of the most difficult.
It took me just as long to swap that front tire as it took me to do both front and rear tires on my bike. And I swapped to the Dunlop 605s, which are more of a 50-50 tire versus the 70-30s as the Dunlop 606 and the Pirelli MT21 Rallycross. These definitely are going to do a better job in the dirt, but the 605s, so far I've put about 80 miles on them, just on back roads in the street, and they corner phenomenally. Now we shall see how well they do on the trails, though.
All right, well, special thank you to Adam for helping me out and teaching me and us of how to change out a tire on a motorcycle. Well, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow as more adventures are coming along.